Sharon Tong. Welcome to In Parliament. Today, 5 bills were debated in Parliament. These included bills covering energy conservation, public utilities and international arbitration. But first, during question time, Transport Minister Louis Tak Yew was asked how much resources is being spent on the preventive maintenance of the rail, track and tunnel of the North East Line. Mr. Louis said train operator SBS Transit spent $16 million over the last 5 years. This amount went specifically to the upkeep of rail tracks, tunnels and the overhead power supply lines used to supply electricity to trains. Mr. Louis said the sum is a fraction of total maintenance costs for the North East Line. The question follows a 10-hour breakdown that hit the network last month.
There are a lot of unhappiness among the commuters due to the frequent breakdown especially over the last few months. What more can be done?
For more than 18 hours a day, and I dare say that there is no way you can prevent disruptions from occurring. What you try to do is that you minimize the major disruptions, and if they do take place, you then have an incident management plan in place that will then try to ameliorate the effects on the commuters.
Moving to another mode of public transport, Mr. Louis reported that Singapore's 2 public bus operators will have to hire about 1,600 more drivers for an incoming fleet of 800 buses. That's 2 drivers to operate 1 bus per day. He added that the government will not micromanage how operators attract and retain manpower. Some MPs also raised concerns about foreigners who make up a considerable proportion of bus drivers.
We expect more foreigners to become bus drivers. Is the ministry concerned that these foreign bus drivers, foreigners, might visit our casinos? And I think we're all aware that without enough sleep, a bus driver without enough sleep can be a public safety hazard.
I would hasten to add that it is probably a host of activities and not just visiting the casino that might keep not only the drivers but all of us awake at night, including Euro football and everything else. We must not only train the drivers in terms of equipping them with the skills, but preparing them for life in Singapore, which may be very different from what they are accustomed to in the past. Okay? And hence, part of the training program is to make sure that we infuse with them the responsibility that they carry when they drive a vehicle like a bus, and to make sure that they pay stringent attention to road conditions, to making sure that they operate their vehicles in as safe a manner as possible.
Still on the roads, the Transport Minister said the Malaysian government has not yet made a decision on vehicle toll charges for the Eastern Dispersal Link. Mr. Louis said this was what authorities across the causeway told him. The Eastern Dispersal Link is a yet-to-be-opened highway expected to improve accessibility in Johor Bahru, but concern has arisen over reports that Malaysian authorities may pass on the cost of building the highway to motorists with higher tolls for Singapore-registered cars.
Our consistent practice is that we peg our tolls to match those set by Malaysia. This should apply to all vehicles using the causeway or the second link, regardless of whether they are Singapore registered or foreign registered. Depending on the eventual details of Malaysia's proposal, we will then see how best we should apply this matching principle.
Shifting to the issue of housing, Singaporeans can expect the lift upgrading program for all eligible flats island-wide to be completed by the end of 2014. Giving an update in Parliament, Minister of State for National Development Lee Yi-Hsien said upgrading has been completed for 65% of the 5,000 eligible flats so far, whereas polling has been completed for 95% of these blocks. To minimize disruption to residents, Mr. Lee said HDB is looking into increasing its use of prefabrication technology in lift upgrading as far as possible.
Many of my residents ask me, how come it takes 2 years to upgrade a lift when we can build condominiums in the same time? And really, the crux of the issue is about how work is being phased. Let's take us 8 blocks involved. Basically, the work is done in batches. You start digging in one block, you finish, you go to the next one. and you go one round before you come back to the first one to do the next step.
One of the reasons, of course, compared to a condominium or new flats built on a greenfield site, the LUP work has essentially has to be constrained by the fact that it is on existing site, tight site, and hours of construction and so on has to be limited, to minimize inconveniences and noise pollution to the residents. The other, the observation about, whether we could, instead of treating the whole precinct as one work site, whether we can go by block to block. HDB is studying that.
Senior Parliamentary Secretary for National Development Dr. Maliki Osman says HDB has a proactive program to help families in arrears for their rental flats, and these include financial counselling and help under ComCare schemes. However, he said an eviction order may be inevitable in the case of uncooperative tenants.
What is the trigger point at which the notice to quit will be issued to the tenant? How many months of arrears typically?
Although the notice to quit is issued at the point of the third month, I can assure Ms. Lim and members of the House that many, many months afterwards, HDB continues to work with the family. HDB continues to help the family. We don't usually take any further action until 9 months or even several years after the family is in arrears. Since 2003, only 3 cases have been evicted because we try very, very hard to make sure that the circumstances of the family is well understood and the families is given the necessary assistance. We acknowledge that when it comes to rental arrears, it's more than just a housing issue. It's really a social issue that sometimes families are trapped with, and there are social service systems that we have put in place, and we will galvanize the social service system to help these families.
Several questions were also raised on the issue of education, specifically the effectiveness of the Integrated Programme or IP. Senior Parliamentary Secretary Sim Ann said about 6% of students from the 2004 to 2006 cohorts withdrew from the programme before reaching their second year in junior college, and more than half of these students continued their education on the O-level track. Ms. Sim said the rest withdrew mostly because they relocated overseas. Each year, about 3,400 students are admitted into the IP track. Ms. Sim said almost all who completed the program qualified for publicly funded universities in Singapore.
There are also some positive outcomes that have been observed of students who have completed the program. For instance, they have been observed to be more vocal, more expressive and independent in learning, stronger service to the community because IP students do serve more CIP hours, and also the ability to move between collaborative as well as independent learning styles. All in all, we feel that having this variety of learning pathways will enrich the holistic development of our students.
Is the ministry still seeing a high demand for the IP places? And whether are there plans to expand these places for more students to get into IP program?
The majority of our students are on the O-level track. So the O-level track, I think, retains great relevance for education. What's important, I think, is for students as well as their parents to recognize which style of learning suits the individual student best. Is it one that is more self-directed or independent, or would it be one that is more structured? And this is something which I think goes a long way towards determining the success of the student in either program.
Fewer than 20 students have been identified to be exceptionally gifted in the last 12 years. Ms. Sim Ann said these students have to meet a set of stringent criteria, which include a psychological report and achievement and aptitude tests. She added that data from interviews with parents and classroom observations will also be taken into consideration.
How ready are our tertiary institutions in partnering MOE with to help those who are exceptionally gifted, as some of these children may be so gifted that they can handle university curriculum even at the upper primary level. So do our tertiary institutions take in young students way before the university age? Or are such students, do they have to go overseas for their education? if they couldn't find anything that could be customized to their needs.
When we're talking about exceptionally gifted students, we're really talking about really very small numbers, and each of whom may have very unique circumstances. So I do not think that there is a hard number or an age below which our universities would not consider. This really would depend on many factors. It goes, I think, beyond the intellectual ability of the student, but also in terms of his or her social-emotional readiness and their readiness to, I think, be in a learning setting. Which learning setting would suit the individual best? Coming back to the other question that Mr. Yi has raised, he wants to know whether there have been any students, exceptionally gifted students, who have had to go overseas. Sir, I mentioned just now that fewer than 20 students have been identified since 2000 as being exceptionally gifted. And out of these fewer than 20 students, one is known to have gone overseas to pursue his university education. The rest remain in Singapore. They are at various ages, so they are still going through our educational system. They're still in the schools. And as I've mentioned, the oldest one is already enrolled in a local university.
Ms. Sim also replied to questions about whether the questions set in the primary school leaving examinations favour students in the gifted education program. She said many GEP students do well, mostly because they already exhibit strong academic abilities. But she noted that the GEP is not intended to prepare children for exceptional performance at the PSLE. Rather, it's meant to develop their intellectual depth and higher level thinking while nurturing productive creativity.
May I ask the SPS whether MOE thinks that P4 or age 10 is the right age to categorize students into gifted or non-gifted? Why not classify them after PSLE when most of the students are slightly more mature after going through their first major exam?
The intention is not to classify students into any particular group. And given our commitment to holistic education and given our commitment to bring our students up to their fullest potential, as Mr. Lim well knows, we have many pathways and ladders within the education system for students, for students of all learning profiles, and including students who, as Dr. Intan has mentioned, peak at different times during their journey through our school system.
Shifting to business, the government awards 20% of its tenders to companies with net tangible assets of less than $250,000. These small and medium enterprises also typically win 2 out of 3 contracts with a tender value of $100,000 and below. Minister of State for Finance Josephine Teo assured Parliament that government procurement guidelines aim to provide level playing fields, especially for smaller enterprises.
We also recognize that there may be occasions where the tender value is quite large, and smaller suppliers may need to enter into joint collaborations or consortia in order to be able to compete for those projects fairly. And the way in which to deal with that is to share pertinent information on public sector pipeline projects in advance so that the suppliers have better visibility, and to team up with potential partners.
Moving on to the reading of the bills, amendments to the public utilities as well as the sewerage and drainage bills were passed in Parliament today. The Public Utilities Act was last amended in 2001 and the Sewerage and Drainage Act in 1999. The latest amendments are expected to put in place safeguards to allow the expansion of Singapore's local water catchments and to protect the production of new water. They include higher penalties for damages to water infrastructure like water mains and sewers. Higher penalties too for offences related to the discharge of chemical substances or silt. With the amendments, adequate silt control measures must be installed at work sites before any work takes place. To minimise the risk of used water pollution, PUB will also be taking over the operations, maintenance and repair of all privately owned sewage treatment plants from June 2012. The sanitary appliance fee and waterborne fee, which fund public sewers, will also be reflected as tax.
The proposed amendments to the Public Utilities Act will more properly reflect these charges as a tax contribution to our national used water system, which is an essential part of securing our national water supply. In this regard, past impositions of the water bond fee are also validated as impositions of a tax. Speeches made in this House at the time when the water bond fee was introduced show the government's intention has always been that the water bond fee was to be in the nature of a tax, and this is now being put beyond any doubt. However, let me assure the House that this is not a change in the current rates or the structure of our water charges.
Dr. Balakrishnan repeated this assurance following two clarifications made on the amendments to the bills. He said water prices will not change this year, but added that the cost of producing safe water would be under great pressure in the future. Dr. Balakrishnan pointed out that last financial year, the amount collected in water tariffs and used water fees was about $1 billion. That's less than the $1.3 billion needed every year to provide safe and secure water supply for Singapore. Going forward, Dr. Balakrishnan said the future cost of water will also depend on other factors.
Will Minister clarify whether this amendment is meant to signal any change in the way water is priced? More specifically, is the PUB intending to apportion more of the cost sharing to consumers? And what assurances do Singaporeans have that water will still be priced affordably in the future?
If you postulate for the long term, every additional drop that we're going to have to get, either from expanding our water catchment area and having to make sure that that water is clean, or from recycling water through new water, or from desalination, every additional drop is going to be more difficult and more costly. And the key change that has occurred because of the technological availability of membranes and reverse osmosis is that in the long term, a key determinant of the price or the cost of water is the cost of energy. So no minister for the environment or water resources in Singapore can ever give you a warranty that water prices will not change in the future. It is dependent on so many factors which are beyond our control and are, in a sense, because of our uniquely water-constrained circumstances. I also want to assure the House that we are very mindful that by running a most efficient possible water system, we can maintain water at an affordable rate for all our people. And for even those low-income families, through USAVE, we ensure that everyone has access to water that they need.
Singapore now has new energy regulations which require large energy users to have compulsory conservation practices. The Energy Conservation Bill passed in Parliament today consolidates energy efficiency laws under one act and will be jointly administered by the Environment and Water Resources Ministry and the Transport Ministry. The Environment and Water Resources Minister will oversee measures for industry and household sectors, while the Transport Minister will oversee transport sector measures. From next year, the Act will require large energy users to appoint an energy manager. They will also have to monitor and report energy use and greenhouse gas emissions and submit energy efficiency improvement plans.
The more we grow, the more you think of conserving energy and using it efficiently. Otherwise, we will pursue an ultimately unsustainable growth path. Today, countries face a stark choice: to compete aggressively for finite resources, and this is not a viable option for a small city-state with no natural resources like ours, or to advance towards a more energy-efficient economy and more sustainable pathways to prosperity. For Singapore to continue being prosperous and secure, we must learn how to get more power, more mobility, more lighting, more heating and cooling from less energy.
8 MPs spoke in support of the Energy Conservation Bill, including opposition and nominated members. Several had proposals on how to move Singapore towards the goal of being more energy efficient. The Workers' Party suggested a greater shift towards use of renewable energy sources. The Environment Minister said Singapore's land scarcity and lack of natural resources mean it is an alternative energy disadvantaged country, so setting targets for renewable sources would be unrealistic.
I'd like to call the government to adopt a humane perspective in allowing companies to coherently infuse into such a framework by providing the relevant assistance and support. They could be in the form of guidance and advice on management practices, as well as providing grants for the expected costs some of these companies may incur in its journey towards realizing an efficient energy management culture.
I suggested 2 tax rebates actually for companies which achieve their energy efficiency targets, as well as those that attain the energy efficiency certification that they will be assessed under. So even though the tiered tariffs might result in some high energy users paying a bit more for the energy, this could be actually returned to the companies through the tax rebates.
If I take your proposal to add another levy on top of the market price, it is a real burden on our industry sector. And if you say, well, let's just only target the big consumers, then you can start playing games by having a big company decide it's got multiple subsidiary units and qualifying for the low rate. All these are regulatory games which I believe are counterproductive. The key point is that you have right pricing for energy. It makes sense for everybody to save energy.
Parliament has amended the International Arbitration Bill to further strengthen the country's position as a hub for international arbitration. The changes will, among others, broaden the definition of an arbitration agreement and provide recourse against negative rulings by an arbitral tribunal. Law Minister K. Shanmugam told the House that amendments to the bill will signal Singapore's continued commitment to providing the fullest legislative support for international arbitration.
The bill comes before this House at a significant moment in the context of arbitrations. In June this year, Singapore will host the 21st ICA Congress. That's a significant global arbitral meeting, and it's the first time since 2004 that ICA is meeting in Asia. It emphasizes Singapore's growing status as a hub for international arbitration.
The last bill passed today was the Foreign Limitation Periods Bill. This clarifies which countries' limitation laws will apply to disputes which are heard in Singapore but which are governed by the laws of another jurisdiction. For example, when a contractual dispute is initiated in Singapore in relation to a contract governed by the laws of England, the bill provides that the applicable limitation period will be determined by English law rather than by the laws of Singapore. And finally, Parliament has authorized the Ministry of Finance to borrow a further $170 billion through the issuance of government securities. Minister of State for Finance Josephine Teo said 80% of the increase will be issued to the Central Provident Fund to meet its investment needs. The remaining 20% will go to the Monetary Authority of Singapore for the issuance of Singapore government securities in line with the growth of financial markets. The last increase was approved by Parliament in 2009 when the limit was raised from $250 to $320 billion. The Parliament has been adjourned to a date to be fixed. Good night.